1991 on the 2 to 3 year plan. That's 32 years. The mayors in my time have all been black. The money and power, other than political, has been primarily, not entirely, but primarily white. Black and white. That's the binary equation I've seen dominate this city for my time here, and it's the way it's been since Maynard Jackson became mayor in 1974. I've thought about our city this way, and it's how commentators, reporters, authors, data analysts, and the like have looked at the city for 50 years. But that thinking's out of date. That thinking needs to change if our city is going to continue to grow in a healthy direction. The reality is today that the black and white frame we've used to understand Atlanta must evolve because the population of the city is changing rapidly. It's not just white and black, it's also becoming more and more brown, Latinx, Hispanic. Here are some projections of what the racial dynamics will be from comparing 2015 to 2050. 2015, 48% of Atlanta's population was white. 2050, it'll be 39%. In the same time frame, the black population will go from 33% to 28%. Meanwhile, the Latinx, the Hispanic population, will grow from 12% to 21%. The implications are enormous for our city, for how political power is fought over and divided, for how educators prepare programs, for how employers think about attracting the best and the brightest to their companies. All will need to rethink how they plan for the future if they're going to represent and take advantage of Atlanta's diverse people of the future. Now, I should also say that a portion of our population obviously are South Asian background, Asian American, Pacific Islanders. Those numbers are also growing, and I don't mean in any way to discount their importance. But if we look at 2050, the dynamic that will have the most impact on Atlanta is the growth of the Latinx population. For me, the moment I actually began to recognize this, to understand it, is the first time I went to an Atlanta United game at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. You go to a Falcons game, and the old black-white algorithm is what makes sense. We should all be very proud that the Falcons have the most diverse NFL audience in the league. But if you want to see diverse, if you want to see the future of Atlanta, go to a United game. Our fellow member, Frank Fernandez, President and CEO of the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, will introduce our amazing panel and lead this conversation with this group of leaders from politics, from civic life, and from corporate Atlanta. Frank.
Buenas tardes todos. Good afternoon, everyone. You sit right there. Okay. I'll go to the corner. Before we dive into our panel, I need to say a mea culpa, because I've been, by many of you, been asking where I've been, because I'm a really bad Rotarian, including Pat, who I'm looking at here, also gave me grief for it. And so I committed to David that I will be a better Rotarian. I'll be here at more meetings on a go-forward basis. So I wanted to start on the record. So thank you. So to dive into today's topic, as a son of immigrants and as someone who learned to speak English when he went to school, I am here today in this place, in this country, because my parents had to flee their country. So my mother, Gladys, was the oldest of 4 sisters. With her parents, my grandparents, immigrated here from Cuba. They were in La Habana, which is Havana, in the early 60s, because they saw what was starting to happen in their country, where property was being seized and more and more people being thrown in jail. And so they read the writing on the wall and they fled, and they went to Miami, and most of my family's been in Miami ever since. And then my father, Eduardo, who's a little older than my mother, actually had a more roundabout way. He actually fought with Fidel Castro in the revolution and went in the mountains. Raul Castro was my brother's godfather. But he too felt betrayed because Castro declared him a communist. My father became a counter-revolutionary. Then he had to flee because he was going to be thrown in jail. And he ended up coming to this country actually through Texas, and ended up joining the CIA and was part of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And unfortunately, that did not go as everyone wanted. and he ended up serving in the U.S. Army as a captain in the 101st Airborne Division for 10 years, 2 years in Vietnam. And my father, who actually just passed away a few months ago, was a larger-than-life character. And most of his stories were not subject for public consumption. But his story and my mother's story are two stories of thousands of stories of families, of Latino families and individuals here in the state of Georgia. But there are stories that you don't often hear. Metro Atlanta and Georgia is a very different place than it was when we hosted the Olympics in 1996, or when David came a few years before that. Today, according to the US Census, and some of this data David shared, about 10.5% or 1.1 million residents of Georgia are Latino. And in Metro Atlanta, it's about 730,000 Latino residents, or about 12% of the population. And if you go just about 15, 20-minute driving, where you go to Gwinnett County, go to Gwinnett County Public Schools, the largest by far school district in the state, the largest population of students are Latino. Again, kind of speaking to the direction of where the city and this metro is heading. And when you look at the data that our friends at ARC have provided us, in Metro Atlanta alone, you will see over the next generation or so, more than 1.2 million new Latino residents in this region. And as David said, going from about 11% to over 21%. And to put a fine point on it, 70% of all our demographic growth during that time for the region is Latino or Hispanic and Asian. And so, increasingly, this is a place and community and city that is becoming more and more multicultural. However, much of the conversation has not moved, as David said, beyond that binary, right? When you look at some of the initial federal data, for example, from the recent rental assistance programs that are part of CARE and all the federal programs that came down during the pandemic, only 4% of those dollars went to Hispanic, compared to 64% for black households, even though they honestly share a lot of the same challenges socioeconomically. And then you think about for representation, this stat has always stuck with me. We have about 6,000 elected offices roughly across the state, local and state. And we have less than 20 Latino elected leaders, and we have one of those on the stage here with us today, or 0.33%. Right, so in short, in many ways, part of today's conversation is about how we haven't been able to move beyond that construct that David spoke to. And part of what we want to do is how do we shift that conversation, which is not to say that the black-white dynamic is not foundational, important, and central. It is, and will always be. But how do you broaden it? How do you make it more inclusive of this new reality? You know, how do you make it more reflective of the new South, right? Which is an increasingly more global, more multicultural, more multiracial, more Hispanic, Latino, Latinx place. So, that is what we're going to dive in right now. And so if we're going to turn it over, we're going to sit down, we're going to turn it over, but rather than me read their bios, which is never fun, because it'd be me reading as opposed to them talking, so I'm going to ask each of them. We're going to start with my fellow tall man, State Senator Jason Esteves, and then ask them just a little bit about themselves, right? As well as their origin story about how they and or their family got here. And we'll go down the line, we'll have questions for everybody.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Jason Esteves. I am the proud state senator for Senate District 6, which is Northwest Atlanta, Buckhead, East Cobb, Vinings, Sandy Springs, and Grove Park. And I am also vice president of the legal department at Equifax, where I work with my good friend Julia Houston, who is a member. And I'm also a former public school teacher. I was on the school board for Atlanta Public Schools for about 9 years prior to joining the state senate. My origin story, I was actually born in Puerto Rico, in Santurce, Puerto Rico, which is a suburb of San Juan. Moved to Columbus, Georgia when I was 2. My parents, both Puerto Rican. My dad was in the military, in the Army, and he was stationed in Fort Benning. So we moved and lived in Fort Benning for a while. And like many other families across the country, once one family moves, then one of the grandparents moves, and then the aunts and uncles move, and then the other grandparent moved. And by the time I was 10 years old, most of my family lived in Columbus. And I used to joke that my family probably made up the vast majority of the Puerto Ricans in Columbus, Georgia at the time, because we grew. I mean, it was insane. Each side having about 5 aunts and uncles move to Columbus, including our grandparents. So what David said struck me because it was very much growing up a black and white conversation. And when I would tell people growing up, because Puerto Ricans are very proud of being Puerto Rican, when I would tell people at school, growing up in elementary school, middle school, that I was Puerto Rican, they would look at me like, "What is that? You're black." Just based on the way I looked. So a lot of my childhood was actually having this identity crisis of what I actually was, because I couldn't say I was African American, because that has its own cultural history that I was not a part of. But then at the same time, I had many different experiences as a black boy at the time. Yet at home, I was a Puerto Rican, Hispanic boy. So I struggled a lot with it. So much so, and just to tell you how black and white it was, I remember in 9th grade in high school, Columbus High School, you fill out this demographic card, name, address, race. And I remember explicitly, it was black and white. Those were the options. None of that, black and white. And I remember raising my hand and asking the teacher, "I'm Puerto Rican, what should I put?" And she went to the call box, pressed the button, called to the front office. It was a whole thing. It was a whole thing. You know, my classmates are laughing throughout. And she asked, "I have a student here who's Puerto Rican, what should he mark?" And the front office comes back and says, "White." And everyone started laughing, right? Everyone started laughing. But that just tells you, we were just, and this was in the 90s. The Olympics were coming. We were not equipped in Columbus, Georgia, to deal with the influx of Latinos.
Good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Misty Fernandez. I am a regional director for Georgia Power Company, where I have the honor and privilege to work with our very first ever female president, chairman, and CEO of Georgia Power, who's on day 3 or 4, Kim Green, for day 4. So if you wouldn't mind joining me and just giving her a round of applause. We're so proud of her. And like my colleagues, so I'll tell you a little bit about my origin story. So I'm going to pick up at the Olympics. That's where I'm going to pick up. And because the Olympics, it's hard to understand what the history of Latinos in Georgia looks like without really understanding the key role that the Olympics played, especially for my community, which is the Mexican community. So I'm Mexican American. And back before the Olympics, we lived in Texas. My great-grandmother used to tell us, we didn't cross the border crossed us. That's how far back Texan, Mexican we were. So what a lot of folks may have known is that after Atlanta won the bid for the '96 Olympics, the city started falling behind on construction schedule. And so we needed pretty quickly a migration of workforce to come in. We needed construction workers. And I'm going to come back to that point later about shortage of construction workers. So the then Consulate General of Mexico worked with federal authorities and our governor at the time to bring in over 70,000 Mexican workers from out west, from Mexico and from out west. And yours truly was one of those families that came and responded to that call of labor. So my family worked in construction. We were a cement family by trade. It is fun. I could ride you around some parts of South Atlanta where I grew up and show you all the places that my dad laid the foundation for. But extremely proud to really have been part of the fabric of the state and built the infrastructure that quite literally changed the trajectory of Atlanta and for the state for us for decades to come. And so that's my origin story. Since then, I was the first person in my family to graduate high school first person to graduate college, first corporate professional. So a world of first for me, and just extremely proud and honored, and never imagined that I'd be on a stage with an audience and friends like you in our business community, but extremely proud to work for a company that's been so engaged, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, in really building the communities that we have the privilege to work and serve and live in. So, Santiago?
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here, and I'm a fellow Rotarian, so I belong to the Buckhead Rotary, so thank you for having me, and thank you, Frank, for asking. I am the CEO of the Latin American Association, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as we get into another question. I have actually been a nonprofit professional since 1998. I actually started my career here at Consumer Credit Counseling Service in the building over here, what we call the United Way building. And went to graduate school at Georgia State, so I know this area very well. I then, many years later, went to graduate school at Notre Dame and was able to fulfill my dream of getting a master's in nonprofit administration, which has been my entire career. This is what I've dedicated my life to. And the reason is because of my origin story. I was born in Cuba, much like Frank, in 1970. In order for my parents to come from Cuba, my dad had to go cut sugarcane at a work camp for 3 years until our number came up. It was like a lottery system. And my mother was a school teacher, and one day she was, I don't know how else to say it, kidnapped from the house by the government, interrogated for 12 hours, and essentially the government wanted her to denounce her faith. She's a very staunch Catholic, and she said, no way, that's not happening. Fortunately, my grandfather ran all the milk for Nestle pre-revolution, so he had enough connections to get my mother out of that situation. We made it to the States in '71. I was a year old, and we ended up in Portland, Oregon. Not a lot of Hispanics in Portland, Oregon in 1971, but the only family that we had was in Portland, Oregon. And believe it or not, there were about 12 Cuban families in Portland, Oregon that all knew each other. There was a little bodeguita, little grocery store where all the Cubans would congregate, have coffee and talk. And because of that, we felt like we had a little community. But I spent my youth really believing that we were going to go back to Cuba as soon as Fidel was assassinated or he was taken out of power, until we became American citizens in 1978. And at that point, I realized, this is it. Like, I'm an American now. And I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was special, and I knew it was a life changer, right? Make a long story short, I saw my mother go to school at night, learn English, then I saw her get a degree. She got a job with Georgia Pacific, and in 1982, as a 12-year-old, we came here to Georgia. And so now I'm a Georgian. Been here over 40 years, a proud Georgian, with Cuban roots. And I will say this, the one thing about my origin story is I'm really lucky that the minute I got here, I was documented, right? And unlike a lot of the people that we serve that are not documented, my life has been relatively easy in the United States because of that. And I never forget that. And that's why I've dedicated my life to the nonprofit sector, because I feel like I owe so much that I want to pay it forward.
Thank you, all three of you, for sharing your story. So we're going to dive into some specific questions for folks. I'm going to start with Misty. So you heard from Misty about her story, talked about her dad was a cement guy, right? And then the area of construction. So one of the things I want to ask you, Misty, is just to talk about what you think are the opportunities and challenges in both directions for Latinos and Latino workers in Georgia, given everything going on.
So thank you for that question. Can I take a brief pause and just calibrate for a minute? Because I'm going to use a couple of terms interchangeably, and I just want to make sure, in case there's any questions out there. So Hispanic and Latino, for most of us, we will use interchangeably. Although they're not the same thing, both terms apply to the majority of our population. So we'll use those, and at the end, if we have time, if anyone wants to do a quick dive on the difference between Hispanic and Latino, we would love to share that insight with you. I'll also use Latinx, because Latinx is a newer, modern term. It's part of the vernacular of more on the D, E, and I front, but it's gender inclusive because Spanish, as many of you know, has masculinity and femininity to it. So Latinx for us makes it. Know that Latinx has mixed reviews in our community. It's not liked by all, but some of us still use it. So I just want to put those disclaimers out there as you hear me use those terms. But a couple of stats. So talking about the growth, which we started off with, what's really exciting about Atlanta and the Atlanta region, right? So with fresh information from the census, we just saw that the growth within the Latinx population has continued to grow over the last decade. In fact, it's been over 30%. What's interesting about that over 30% is that every county in the 11-county metro area has seen double-digit growth. So we still see centers like Gwinnett and Cobb and DeKalb being big employment and residential centers. So think of Dorville and Norcross and the Beaufort Highway corridor. And you also see counties like Forsyth and Henry, right, and Cherokee that are growing because this is where Latinx populations, second and third generation Latinx populations, are moving further out. But what's cool about these stats is that median age of our Latinx population in our region, that age is 27. And when you compare it to the median age for the rest of the other demographic groups, that age is 37. So you have a fast-growing, youthful population, and what better workforce cluster could there be, right? So I just want to leave you with that stat to think about. Also want to share, so I'm going to go into 3 or 4 other insights from a workforce perspective, because many of you know that we at Georgia Power are deep into the workforce space. Economic development is one of our specialties. And so I'd like to give credit to a team that helped put a lot of this information together. But let's talk first about entrepreneurship, because that's a big area workforce with a clear pathway for us. So thanks to an organization, Latino Community Fund, that worked with UGA's Small Business Development Center, they confirmed a couple of years ago what we already know. Immigrants and foreign-born populations have a high concentration of entrepreneurs. We already know that. What's interesting is for us in Georgia, less than 4% of those entrepreneurs are Latinx, are from the Latinx population. And over half of those businesses have revenues of less than $250,000. So the opportunity as it relates to entrepreneurship, especially when over 60% of those entrepreneurs are female, Latina entrepreneurs, which Santiago will talk about a little bit with the LAA, the opportunity there is to help them get access to capital and access so that they can be scalable. And so wanted to just share those stats with you because you may or may not have known that in addition to being a quickly growing population, it's a quickly growing business community. All right, so I'm going to move over to skilled trade and some things that we see from this angle. So on the skilled trade side, it's easy to think of construction. We do represent a large workforce in the construction industry. And our friend Anna Roach and the ARC team and Santiago and I have had conversations about how does the state get ready for this influx of federal dollars coming in and these infrastructure investments that have to be done, these projects, big projects. How do we solve for the construction worker shortage that we're seeing today? Because this feels like a little full circle moment for me, who came with the Olympics as part of that migration of construction workers. How do we use programs and awesome models like what Frank started when he was with AMB, the Construction Ready model, which works with a variety of populations, but also includes our Latinx populations. And so while we have a large Latino presence in several industries, and those industries are the ones that you think of, they're temp help industries, janitorial industries, schools, restaurants is at the top. Those are all jobs that require little skills and traditionally have lower pay. So the opportunity for us there too is to upskill for additional economic mobility. And we have amazing nonprofits, Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Latin American Association, and others that are working with our community to do that. And so the final insight that I'd like to offer is from a corporate perspective. And so the talent pipeline, 2 pieces here, the talent pipeline, increasing the representation and diversifying our talent pipeline in the professional industry. So at Georgia Power, we've been doing this for years. We have actively, proactively, intentionally recruited Latinx population into our engineering and our customer service disciplines, right? But several of you run companies where that opportunity may still exist. And so how do you mentor and cultivate programs that attract these pipelines, starting at the K through 12 pipeline? Because it's not enough to just hire out of that pool. You have to be intentional about reaching them way earlier and exposing them to your industry and making them aware of your workforce opportunities. And then I'll close with the minority business spend. So another great area here, doing more than just checking the box on what we do with supplier diversity, but really helping these businesses not just have access to capital, access to your customers, and then having the most important access, which we all are very familiar with, access to relationships. Because that relationship ecosystem makes a huge difference and is an ecosystem that several of our businesses sometimes don't know how to get access to. So just a few thoughts here.
Great, thank you, Misty. Jason, so you just finished your first session. So legislatively speaking, talk to us a little bit about what were your priorities from a Latinx perspective.
Yeah, so to piggyback off Misty, a little bit of a disclaimer here. The Latino population is very diverse, right? You have not only Latinos that come from all across Latin America, there are diversities within each country as well. You have Afro-Latino is a word that did not exist when I was growing up in Georgia, but the intersection of Black and Latino, which I sit. But there are other folks who are white, consider themselves to be white and Latino. There are other folks who don't consider that at all, and they are Mexican American. Others are. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that Latinos see themselves, and with that comes views on various issues because of their own lived experiences. So I want to disclaim that in order to say that there's a perception that the Latino community is primarily concerned with immigration and with the economy, businesses. And I'm here to tell you, the reality is the diversity in our community makes us very similar to our other communities in this country. Ultimately, what our families care about is an opportunity for our families to live in a safe place where our children have the opportunity to learn and have the opportunity to succeed and thrive. So Latinos are concerned about education, healthcare, transportation, the economy, making sure that there is affordable housing, a lot of the same issues that we're all dealing with. So at the Capitol, a lot of the issues that I've been dealing with involving education and healthcare and housing are issues that folks in the Latino community care about. Now, here's a slight difference is because of the lived experiences of people in the Latino community, access becomes an issue. One, in language, right? Just an example, while Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens upon birth instantly, we don't have the same experiences that an immigrant would from Paraguay or from Mexico. But I'll tell you, some of the experiences within the state are very similar, right? Access because of language. My grandmother, who moved here, like I told you earlier, moved here when I was a little boy, moved to Georgia 37 years ago, cannot speak to you in English. Today, she's 90-something, still cannot speak English. She's lived in this country for over 30 years. She has been able to live in this country and speak nothing but Spanish, worked in our schools speaking not a lick of English, right? However, in order to access, and all of you know this, so many services, whether it's in the private sector or public sector, having that English proficiency is incredibly important to get the resources you need. Ensuring that all of our systems are accounting for people who do not speak English as a first language is very important. So that's something that's been on my mind. Immigration status, also very important. While my family has not had to deal with that, many in the Latino community have had to deal with that. So thinking about things, for example, in education, where you have DACA recipients, people who have lived in this state since they were very young, 1 year old up to early teens. All they know is Georgia. But because of some of the policies we have in the state, if they wanted to go to UGA, for example, they would have to pay out-of-state tuition. They would have to pay higher tuition than someone who is a U.S. citizen and may have moved to Georgia 2 years ago. Those folks would be afforded in-state tuition, whereas a DACA recipient who has lived here almost all their life would have to pay out-of-state tuition. So one of the things that, particularly in the second session, I plan on dropping a bill that would help address that. Another issue that affects all of us is driver's licenses. We're one of those states that does not offer driver's licenses unless you have citizenship or some kind of documentation status in the United States. And what we're finding is that impacts the ability for some Latino families to drive to work, to be engaged in our economy. And if they are doing it, they're doing it illegally, which increase risks for all of us, including those families. Here's where it affects you as an uninsured motorist, because they can't get the appropriate insurance, they don't have the driver's license. It increases costs for all of us, while at the same time impacting the bottom line for those families. So it's one of those issues that I plan on introducing legislation to hopefully address and fix, and join states like Utah and Maryland that allow folks who are not documented to get driver's licenses, so that we can hopefully have a safer environment. So those are some issues that I'm particularly working on at the state capitol. But you'll notice a common thread in all of those instances. It all comes back to what many of you are concerned about. It's about making sure that our families are being able to be in a place where we can thrive, where it's fair, and where we can live our lives happily.
Thank you, Jason. Santiago. So Santiago runs LAA, one of the longest-standing Latino-led and serving nonprofits in our region, and they focus on those you heard here who are often voiceless and faceless for a variety of reasons. Talk to us a little bit about what you see the big needs are of the folks you serve, Santiago.
Sure. And just a quick bit about the LAA for those of you that don't know. Latin American Association. It's a 50-year-old social service organization, 4 locations. Buford Highway is probably the building you guys have seen, 43,000 square foot facility. We have 1 in Gwinnett and 2 in Dalton, Georgia. And we serve about 43,000 people a year, okay? And we just finished a new strategic plan, and everything is under economic mobility for us right now, right? The whole idea of creating opportunity for all and helping Latinos to thrive under, that big umbrella of economic mobility. 3 pillars that we organize our work, and then I'm going to get right to your question, but I just want people to understand what we do. First is family well-being and stabilization, so social work, public benefits, victims of violence, food pantry, kind of the emergency services. 2 is workforce development, and there's a lot under that, so I'm not even going to do a deep dive in there, but just know that we start with immigration lawyers. We actually have immigration lawyers on staff that are really focusing now on citizenship and residency, so we can get our community able to really have gainful employment. And then 3 is entrepreneurship for women, and we have an incubator in our building, and we're now in the process of looking at maybe becoming a CDFI so we can actually lend money to those businesses that need it. So what we're seeing is a community. So the people that we work with tend to be the folks that are most vulnerable, right? A good percentage of them are either undocumented or have mixed status. So somebody in the house may have documentation, but somebody else doesn't, or the rest of the family does not. That's important for everything that's been mentioned here, especially what Jason was talking about in terms of school and driving. We deal with a community that was already hurting pre-pandemic and got walloped during the pandemic. A community that was the essential workforce that put bread on our table, right? When most of us here were probably working at home like I was, getting our groceries delivered, it was this community that was making it happen for us. So what's happened post-pandemic? Well, they still don't have access to health care. They still don't have driver's license. Many of them don't have documentation. So out of the 43,000 that we serve, the best thing we can do for many of them, for 20,000, is to try to get them SNAP benefits, right? Try to get them food stamps, public benefits, if there's somebody in the family who qualifies, because that at least starts to help them get out of poverty. Poverty is what I'm talking about, right? The community's still trying to get out of poverty, the community that we work with. 700 kids that fell off the maps, off the rosters in Gwinnett County schools during the pandemic. We just lost touch with them. We believe many of them maybe went to work to try to help their families get through as the families were experiencing job loss, right? And we now know that many of those kids are behind. The ones that did stay in school are behind in reading and math. And so we lost a couple of years there with our youth. Again, the youth that was probably already struggling pre-pandemic. So I don't want to be bleak, because the one thing that we do have is resilience in the community. And they come here for the American dream. What they want to do is they want to work, and they want to build a better life. They want what we all want. So this is a community that's already been through heck to get here, sacrificed their lives. All they want is a shot at the American dream, and that's what we're working towards at the LAA and in partnership with Jason and others, right? Just to help them get a bite of that apple.
So Santiago, Frank, Jason, Misty, you do reflect the American dream. Thank you so much for your input, and please come up and thank our panelists afterwards and learn the distinction between Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx too. Let's give them a hand, please.